if you want to welcome Dr. Cynthia.
Absolutely. Dr. Cynthia, thank you so much for coming. We're all really anxious to hear what you've got to say. But the first thing I want to show you is this. I can do this right. You see that sign, that little ticket there? It says Dr. Cynthia. You won a $25 door prize.
Before I even got in the door.
Before you even got in the door.
Wow,
Yes.
you're good.
You're good.
So
lucky.
this is I'm really looking forward to hearing you, and I know that Elaine will have a few words to say first.
Yes. Before we start, Cynthia, I just wanted to make sure that you're okay if we're recording this meeting. Good. Okay, well, let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Cynthia Wesley-Esquimaux. Has served as the Vice Provost for Indigenous Initiatives at Lakehead University for a number of years. Effective September 2016, she was appointed as the first Indigenous Chair for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada for Lakehead University. She's responsible for the development and implementation of the President's Council for the Truth and Reconciliation and the 8 modules that have been designed to engage the staff, faculty, administration of the Lakehead community. She was an inaugural Nexen Chair for Indigenous Leadership at the Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity and remains a faculty member in the Indigenous Learning Program. She is a board member for the Teach for Canada nonprofit, which addresses the needs of Indigenous school in Northern Ontario. Cynthia was inducted as an honorary witness by the Truth and Reconciliation Council of Canada in 2014 and is the chair of governing circle for the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation at the University of Manitoba. She's a member in residence of the Chippewa of Georgina Island First Nations in Ontario and has dedicated her life to building bridges of understanding between people. She sees endless merit in bringing people from diverse cultures, ages, and backgrounds together to engage in practical dialogue and applied research initiatives. She is deeply committed to public education and active youth engagement for all cultures and backgrounds. Cynthia co-founded a youth project out of the University of Toronto, the University of Saskatchewan, and Lakehead University. She was also the facilitator for more than half the discussions across Canada and the pre-inquiry on the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Welcome, Cynthia.
Thank you. Thanks for that. It always makes me feel like, oh my goodness, does she sleep? Yes, I do actually. So thank you for the invitation. So I'm not going to show you slides or anything. I'm just going to talk to you about, some of you are very interested in the conversation that I had over, I think it was with Matt Galloway on CBC. They were talking about what's happening with children across Canada, and there's some very important things that are happening across Canada. So I want to talk a little bit about some of those things, but I also want to talk to you about it from an Indigenous perspective, from my perspective. So I'm going to talk, and then I want to be able to leave some space for some questions. So first, I want to thank you for the invitation, because it's an important conversation that we're having, and I appreciate very much all of you women coming together. I just got off another call with a whole bunch of women who are also doing some work in on the what do they call them, the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations, and they want to change it to actually girl-driven or girl experienced change. Like they want to put women into this picture and say, well, if women were doing the Sustainable Development Goals, what would they look like instead of men, right? So there's lots of conversations like that. And of course, right now we're really collectively reflecting on some of the very important things that have just recently happened, like the launch of a very special day on the 30th of September, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, which I think was a very important step for the government to take, and a very important step for us as Indigenous peoples to request and acknowledge and accept. Not that everybody felt all that great about it, because of course there was a lot of people that felt that that wasn't really enough, and of course it isn't. But it was an opportunity, and the recognition is critical as we move into a deeper process of identifying what are the barriers to reconciliation in Canada. What do we really need to do? And however, it's because of supporters like yourselves that are interested in this conversation and have gathered over time because of it. And also there's a lot of other people that are working across the country that have made things like this happen. So this is an important result of that. And action is the result of people enthusiastically sharing a desire for change and arriving with open minds and open hearts and all those things as we build what we would call healthy and strong relations. So to me, it means we're all willing to take some responsibility to each do our small part to ensure positive change actually happens. And that's a big undertaking. So there's many people from lots of backgrounds who've offered positive words and important work in many, many areas, including the changing of child welfare policies and standards. And you have women at this table today that have been working diligently and collectively for a very long time to try to approach just that. And I salute you for all the work you do. Wendy, we've had conversations before. And some of you have heard me speak on child welfare before and how important it is in addressing what is happening across Canada. Many people have expressed compassion in regards to the history and contemporary circumstances of Indigenous peoples. And it's people like you, each one of you, and so many others have joined our hearts together and contributed in various ways to the successes that Indigenous people are having in breaking those negative cycles that have plagued our communities, our people for so long. And again, we can talk a little bit more about that, but just to say that there is these cycles that we have been working very diligently on as well. We've helped, we've had a lot of help for Indigenous women in particular who are fighting the imposition of other people's ideas about what is right for us as women, and of course for women generally, something I've termed the violence of benevolence. Because help can become a violence when the right to choose is consistently removed through policy and practice and tragically harms the ability of people to make their own decisions about their own lives. And I want to share with you, most of you have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, something he received, and I use the word loosely here, from the Blackfoot Nation and the Blackfoot model on life actualization. Maslow taught us that we come in unformed and that we have to be shaped into something by society. And this we know from Indigenous experience can be pretty tragic and provide a warped orientation in so many fundamental ways. And you only have to listen to the stories of Indian residential school survivors and child welfare survivors to know this is the case. And so allowing Western society to inform and shape Indigenous lives has brought confusion, dysfunctional relationships, dysfunctional sexuality, and of course addictions. And yet I've had so many elders say to me over the course of time and the work that I've done, across Ontario, across Canada, the Banff Centre, that we have our own ways. And we really need to reconstitute those ways in our homes and in our communities. But the Blackfoot Nation, who originated this model that Maslow has put into the world and people seem to know so much about, they actually tell us that we actually come into the world already self-actualized. That triangle where Maslow says, you need all these things, food, shelter, and all this, and then you climb up that model and you become self-actualized at the top. At the top where the 1% are now living and sending themselves to the moon. Is actually incorrect. That we actually come into the world self-actualized, and our goal is not a selfish pursuit for anything and everything we can get. It's about the preservation and protection of our families, our languages, our ceremonies, our cultures, our arts, and everything else that makes us us into the future. So really what the Blackfoot Nation was saying is we're to be of service to our nations and create and lift culture perpetuity. That is actually the pinnacle, is when we're actually being of service to our people. And it doesn't mean, you have to be Indigenous, anybody. It's not about acquisition. It's about actual culture perpetuity. So, for us, our goal is to bring back our stories, bring back our tricksters, our traditional family circles, and we have to learn to lift each other every day in every way. That's what's really this story is about for us. So I'll call this talk Protecting the Feminine Spirit, because it's also the feminine that brings life into the world and is in place to actually honor it. So, and it's also in honor of the thousands of children being revealed across Canada in unmarked graves who never made it home. And it's also because of the Human Rights Commission decision that was just handed down on the 29th of September, just before Orange Shirt Day, just before the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. So as women of action, and I'm sure all of you are, we need to reflect on the fight by Dr. Cindy Blackstock to ensure the health and well-being of children is taken into consideration and raised to a higher level across Canada. That is our responsibility. Her work has changed the face of child welfare in Canada, and I hope this battle will create not only equitable, but a collaborative resolution to a very long-standing and harmful history that women are still recovering from. Collaborative, very important word. But what does this decision mean for you? You know, what does it mean for Canada? What will it mean for the thousands of children who have had to live under the auspices of child welfare? They've been removed from their homes and communities for most of their lives, and yet they're still yearning to find a way home. There are still a lot of questions to answer, and more reflection will be required as time and effort moves us forward. In the meantime, in spite of the Human Rights Commission decision and the perception of a pitched battle between Blackstock and the federal government, I also see opportunity. I believe that we as women, Indigenous or otherwise, have to take advantage of the first federal government who has said yes and has taken a whole of government approach to Indigenous demands, resolution of some long-standing grievances. And when I say whole of government approach, what I'm saying is that when the Prime Minister gave everybody their mandate letters, every single ministry across every part of government had a mandate to address long-standing grievances and issues with Indigenous people. They all have to do it. Transportation, you know, you name it, they have to do it. So there's reasons and details that we, you know, the public are not necessarily privy to, and I get that. I cannot defend the decision to challenge the $40,000 for each child that has gone into care piece that came out of the Human Rights Commission. I get that, but I also understand that provision of compensation for harm is a complicated and detailed process that entails many decisions, the establishment of trusts, and perhaps multiple hearings to really get it right. I personally have lived the results of land claim settlements and Indian residential school settlements and per capita disbursements in my own family and within my own First Nation community that have caused good, and they've caused harm. And these are important decisions that are made, and there's no easy resolution to long-standing intractable harms. But I also see that sometimes what can happen is if there's no preparatory work that's been done, that they can kind of go off the rails and things can also happen. So, and people can get harmed. And that was the same was true through the Indian residential school resolution process. A lot of people were re-traumatized and ended up being in worse situations than when they started. I mean, they started the healing process, what I mean, and then they started to go right back into it. And then all of a sudden they were, you know, in a worse situation. So but because of all of this, I also want to acknowledge the recent election. And there were 75 Indigenous people who ran in that election, including myself. And why it was so important for us, win or lose, to stand up and have our voices included in that conversation. And I also want to send kudos to those Indigenous candidates, including Jason Henry, who's the chief of Kettle and Stony Point, and Duke Pelche, the chief of Wikwemikong, who stepped out of their political roles to raise their voices in this election. Yes, they know, and I know, that it's a colonial institution. They have interacted with it, like most Indigenous peoples, for their entire lives. But they, like me, and the other 72 Indigenous people who ran, also recognize that our voices need to be represented at those tables, because no one knows like we do what has to happen on the ground. And we're the intergenerational survivors. Our parents went to residential schools. We are the ones who live in the communities, navigate the damages and governmental impacts every single day. So I want you to be aware, however, that Indigenous peoples have still come a long way. And even though we don't all agree that we have to take our voices into the House of Commons, I believe there's good reason to do so. And I believe that those chiefs who stepped out of their political offices to take this responsibility on also believe that if we can't make it happen in our communities quickly enough, then maybe we have to step into other places to bang the drum there. So I think that's really was what that was all about. I also want to speak to the impacts of child welfare itself and the continuing scoops, the birth alerts, and the aging out of our kids and where those kids are landing, which is far too often in poverty and or incarceration. Very important situation that we all have to address as well. And so the Children's Aid Society, or various renditions of it, have been present since the 1920s in Canada. and I would say deeply into the homes of Indigenous peoples and communities for at least 75 years. After the Indian residential schools failed to fundamentally change or kill the Indian and Indigenous children, the CAS moved in, and they too have had a very significant impact on the health and well-being of our people. But so we've had to fight back. We've had to take back jurisdiction and authority over our children at home by drafting and confirming our own child well-being laws. So here in Ontario, the Anishinaabe Nation has ratified their own child well-being law, and they are enforcing it. There are communities across the country who are already there and more in progress. They are taking what I would call very creative measures to ensure their children remain connected to their communities. In 2016, I was appointed as the Minister's Special Representative on Child Welfare. And I traveled across Canada for 3 months from coast to coast to coast. I spoke to mothers, I spoke to grandmothers, and I spoke to officials at lots of levels. And people shared the many alternatives to apprehension that they had designed, because the child welfare system is an apprehension model, and we want to move to prevention. So they're acting on prevention, even if a lot of the agencies are not. One BC nation lost a child to a non-Indigenous family, and then her sister was removed about a year later. And rather than accept those children as gone, they decided to adopt the entire non-Indigenous family into their nation. So they became a part of their community, and they kept the girls connected to the community and to their families. And those are some of the kinds of efforts that are being made to foster our own children in community. But trust me, it hasn't been easy, and there are many reasons why it's taken so much time. Another story was a grandmother who had some very difficulties. Maybe, I'll get to that as I'm moving forward. Resources are certainly a factor, and I think anybody that works with children and works with child welfare can attest to that. And the rules that have been set by external, what I call armchair thinking, people who are outside of the communities, who probably never been in the communities, who are making the kinds of decisions. And that causes a continuing legacy of hurt. The missing and murdered Indigenous women are sometimes a part of that process, the men and boys, and lots of the children that are left behind when people leave their communities are killed through the missing and murdered Indigenous women piece. And of course, there's a scourge of drugs and addictions that are affecting really the entire country and people from all backgrounds, not just ours. But in the end, our children are our children, and we must be the ones to raise them, to teach them, and to guide them so that they can raise their own children well in turn. The hurts we've all experienced can be healed, and we have the power within us, and we know we are the hope of our ancestors, and that we have to walk in a new direction without the shackles of residential schools and continuing colonialism pulling us backwards. We have to remain vigilant and ensure we protect our children, Indigenous rights, our treaties, and our futures by continuing to take what we call a regenerative approach to the traditional values and teachings of our people, and also embrace the value of ceremony. We have to lift each other in every circumstance and have to reach our young, especially those who feel lost and without a nation. And again, I've talked to many youth across the country who have been through the system and have come out of that and said, you took my mother, you took my family, you took my nation, you took my language, you took my home. I have nothing. You left me with nothing. And somehow I have to find a way to come home to wherever home might be. And it's the decisions that have been made outside of our communities and many instances that have caused that. But they want to come home to the teachings. They want to come home to the communities when they've been removed, no matter what the circumstances are, when they left. And they want to come home to themselves and the beauty of who they are. And I remember actually talking to some elders in, I think it was Treaty 7, and they said, we want our children back. We want to bring them back into our communities. And they used the word contaminated. They said, but they're contaminated with drugs and alcohol and ideas that are so very different from ours. And they have had sometimes no experience being raised in community. And we don't know how to integrate them. We don't know how to bring them back into community. And that's something that has happened external to their community. So there's a problem there. But there has been a continuous restoration and sharing of traditional values and knowledge, the teachings and ceremony that has ensured the continuation and strength of our people across Canada. There's been what I would call a profound reconstitution of discipline, responsibility, and a deep focus and listening, which are some of the things that the Indian Act worked very hard to destroy. Change is happening through our young people that have been raised in community and have been raised by people who cared enough to give them a sense of self. And the healing of our elders who experienced so much direct harm in residential and day schools and under the Indian agents that they, were raised in, some of them, because we had Indian agents in our community still around 1969, and under so many restrictive policies. Our young people and more than a few courageous adults are taking back their power and stepping into the world with the lens taken from colleges and university educations and from the traditional knowledge of their own people. They're actually blending those. That sometimes that's called two-eyed seeing. Many have been able to understand, including those in my own age category, that we can learn and practice traditional values and attend ceremony, even if we never experience those things in our childhoods. And for people like me, whose parents came directly out of residential school, that was a stretch. They did not have those access to any of those teachings, and so they also had to reconstitute. But there's been a lot of support from our elders and knowledge keepers and other land-based teachers that have been, that have clearly demonstrated we can learn about those teachings. We can learn our languages, and my daughter is actually one of those people that has actually made that effort, my youngest daughter. And we can attend sweats, and we can attend powwows and sun dances and pipe ceremonies. We can do that. I often say when the adage is when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. And that appears to be happening regularly for our people across Canada. And it's a very good thing. So the other thing I guess is that it's important for you to understand is our children seem to be coming into the world ready to walk directly into a different kind of experience. And they have a kind of almost an uncanny knowledge they're bringing out, they're being born with, like our eighth fire. And they are bringing change with them. They're arriving as many, many more families are able to deliver healthy lived experience. My daughter's is a young mother, and she's like, she'll have none of the experiences that I had. She didn't have them either, but it's getting better generation by generation. I remember a grandmother sharing with me how her toddler grandson wanted to know the words for everything he was learning, like any child. But with this child, not only in English, he wanted to know all of the words in Mohawk as well. So, she said he absolutely savored the language, like my year-old granddaughter does too, just the whole use of words. So her mother's teaching her French, the Indigenous, Anishinaabe, and she's also teaching her English. So she's learning 3 languages at the same time. Everything has to be named, and that's what they're asking for. So I'm sure like that little boy, like my little granddaughter, will be language speakers because their mothers have chosen to give them that gift. So quite a lot of people say, well, what happened? Like, why are you, in this place of reconstitution? What happened to you that all of these cycles have to be broken? Well, in my life, I participated in many kinds of healings. I've watched and dedicated over 30 years of direct time and attention to addressing the effects of historic trauma, residential institutions, Indian hospitals, child welfare impacts, all of which have resonated loudly and persistently into the present. We've been on this sort of long-term healing journey. And, I have to say, I've been a part of that journey for at least the last 25 or 30 years, and it has made a difference. And it has been a struggle. And we finally understand that hurt people, and that we have to let go of the stigma of history, and we have to look to the future. And I've been saying that for a long time, it's not going anywhere. Just leave it there and keep moving into the future. And, if you have to go back and look every once in a while, fine. But the fact is the history is going to stay where it is. So, I'm also gratified to know that Canadians from lots of backgrounds are recognizing they need to do the same. And the establishment of the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation hopefully marks the day when we can all come together to do our best to respect and acknowledge history, place it, the truth of it right out there, and then also learn that we can move on from it. We don't have to be stuck there. We've also been looking at the impacts of adverse childhood experiences and applying that understanding and insight to the continuing legacy of hurt and disrespect we still see being passed on intergenerationally within our communities, because we're not there yet. And where is there? Well, there's a place where our women and children are safe from physical and domestic violences, where we accept that the only way to stop those effects from continuing is to fully understand them and work together so that each parent, all women, all men, and ensure they have the supports to be the kind of parents they may not have had, but want to be for next generations. When we can see that we're all trying hard to be our best selves and to lift our nations. When we stop before we criticize and hurt each other, and when we celebrate the gifts we bring to the table. So we're learning all of that, but that's the stuff, right? And again, there's no time to go into the detail. And so what are we doing today, and what's working? Well, we're increasingly aware of what we need to do. We're reopening our hearts that were so cruelly closed by 7 generations. 7 generations that were brutalized by the Indian residential schools, Indian hospitals, and child welfare systems. And we know we can breathe a bit easier, celebrate steps forward, even the small ones, and work with our elders who bring something to the table. We're reclaiming, sharing a strong sense of belonging. We're embracing knowledge acquisition from those elders who have always loved us, but have had to master their own hurts and losses from their own adverse childhood experience. And we see them stepping up and healing the circles of our lives. We're being honest, and that truth telling has helped immensely. It has taught Canada some fundamental truths as well about the history of this particular country, and what was hidden is now revealed, whether it's unmarked graves or whether it's residential school survivors. It's a long history that had to be told, that people needed to learn about, and that honesty has been very challenging. It's been very uncomfortable making. People have really struggled with it. But I think it's important that we have those conversations in this conversation, and that you ask questions, because we are coming out of it, and it's taken a good 60 or more years to actually start to pull that together. But we're not done yet, and neither's Canada. We're learning that we have to consciously and collectively cultivate kindness, not just Indigenous peoples, but everybody. We have to have a deep understanding that behind some of those smiles, sometimes anger, and sometimes addictions, are deep hurts that want to be healed. And we're trying to walk forward in a good way. So what's in it for everybody else? People ask me, Salah, well, what's in it for Canadians? Well, perhaps a kinder, better, safer, and more inclusive Canada. And perhaps an opportunity to really pick up some of the grievances, some of the 94 calls to action, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the fact that treaties are still alive and well across Canada and need to be implemented, the need to change the standards on child welfare for people that are living in Natchitoches and Labrador and Oak Crow and, near the Alaska border, that what happens in those communities is not the same as what happens in downtown Toronto. That the standards have to be amended to accommodate the needs in the places where people live, not where somebody sitting in an armchair decides they might be. So we can't get to those places until we actively understand that it's part of the decision-making of our governments and our institutions and our organizations that actually create this divide that we're trying to close, whether it's about education, whether it's about child welfare, whether it's about social justice or even justice. So there's lots around that. But, in closing, I want to still say congratulations, because it's conversations like this that ensure we reach out to each other, that we do lift each other, especially as young mothers and especially as women. And we lift the fathers and the men who feel sometimes that they're left out of the conversation. And we have to have that conversation with those who are struggling with uncertainty, sometimes with intractable poverty, because it's so hard to break through that. There's insecure housing that we're dealing with today, growing food challenges that we need to think of. So there's a lot going on that is not just about the Indigenous community and the struggles that they're having, but generally as humanity. We're moving through this time of uncertainty with the pandemic, with climate change and global warming and all the kinds of things that are coming out of that. Those are all something that we all have to collectively, I think, and collaboratively decide that we're going to engage with on a different kind of level. And then we have to honor all of those children who have come through all of these experiences and have become strong adults in our communities and in our families, in spite of the odds stacked against them. They found healing, they found forgiveness, and some of them have found a very good way forward. And I believe that we can do this as an entire people and as an entire country, and I also, want to say, unequivocally, the work is ongoing. It's not over. It hasn't been easy. It's not going to be any easier as we continue on. But I think if we believe that there's possibility, I believe that we can probably get there, that it's up to us to make that commitment to each other to do what we can. And nobody's expecting you to solve the world. We do that on Friday nights with a bottle of wine. We've all saved the world at least once. I know we have. But it's not something that we all expect of you. It's just that we expect that we work collaboratively and work together to actually make the differences. And really, that's all I think I've been asking, even of myself. So I'll leave it there, and then I'd like to have you ask questions, and we can have a conversation.
Thanks, Cynthia, for sharing. There was an awful lot of information there that I'm gonna have to listen to this recording again to try to catch the things that I didn't. I know that. I can't imagine that there's anyone on here that hasn't learned something. And I mean, I certainly know that I don't understand everything. I don't know everything. I'm encouraged to hear you say that there is movement towards positive change. I know this is probably going to take 7 generations to heal. I mean, it's not going to happen overnight. Anyway, we would like to spend some time in discussion with you and have people asking questions, which I'm sure there's lots of them. I think the way we'll do this is there's not that large of a group, so sometimes it's nicer to have the discussion and ask the questions rather than putting it in the chat. If you have a question, to try to keep some order to this, if you just want to put your name in the chat, then I will go through and we'll give everyone a chance to discuss with their questions with Cynthia on this, if that works. So I don't know if we have any questions at this.
It's Kim here.
Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for your remarks. It was very enlightening. One of the topics that has come up in BPW Barrie as a resolution is access to clean water. Mm-hmm. And we know that a lot of northern communities and a lot of Indigenous communities do not have access to clean water. This is troubling for us. We have not been able to tie it into the BPW mandate, even though we know that households are often run and managed by women. How can we address that? My own personal history is that as a nomadic culture, if the water wasn't good, they would have moved on to an area where the water was good and the hunting was good and the ground was fertile to farm. I don't know how that translates into today's culture and what that looks like for somebody like me, who is absolutely appalled that somebody like me cannot go to the tap and have clean, healthy drinking water.
Yeah. So the thing that's different, I think really important, and again, it's impossible to do a comprehensive everything that's going on conversation in a half an hour, 45 minutes, but it's not the same world that people were living in at one time. You're absolutely right. At one time, people across the entire country would have, first of all, they would have had clean water, and they would have moved on if the water wasn't good. But Canada, all the way back to John A. Macdonald, has placed Indigenous peoples on these things called reserves. And even if you listen to the way reserves are described in some people's language, they call them leftover or leftovers, really. That's what they call them. The lands that were not potable, not useful agriculturally or anything. They were stuck on the worst lands possible so that settlement could be given to other people that wanted, the farmers and people like that. So they can't just move on necessarily. And even in places like Natuashish and Sheshatshiu, which are so far north, they're still on settlements. And they're confined to those settlements legally. That's where they have to live. and that's where they're serviced. So putting people in cheek by jowl housing like Scarborough in a remote community is done to accommodate the needs of the people putting in the town. It's easier to put water in a water line in a long line and put house than have people live naturally where they would have with a house over here and a house over here and a house over here, where they were spread out and they weren't, immediately neighbors. So they're living in artificial communities with artificially designed systems of water and electricity and all the rest of it. And it's not a workable solution when you have to live like that. And on top of all that is the pollution that has been generated over the course of time. So even in the far, far north, like Northern Labrador, there are what they call POPs, persistent organic pollutants, that are atmospherically, dropped in their water. So my father, who was living in a remote community in Northern Ontario, said to me, Cynthia, you can come up here and you can see these fantastically beautiful lakes. They are crystal clear to the bottom, and they are absolutely dead. You cannot drink the water. It is unsafe. So here's people living in a place where they should be safe to go and drink the water out of the lake. In fact, we used to do that at Lake Simcoe. Just scoop the water out and drink it. They can't do it. And then I've also heard elders say, we used to scoop the water off the top of the lake and put the bucket by the door with the bugs and the bacteria and all the other stuff. And we drank with dippers, we dropped the dipper back into the lake or into the pail. We never thought, germs, but everybody was healthy. He said, now we draw our water from the bottom of the lake where all the sediments are and all the stuff that's bad has dropped to, and we draw our water, all of us, from the bottom of the lake, including in Toronto and Windsor and everywhere else. And that's really what they call bad water. So we're all getting really shitty water, to be honest, but at least in a city like Aurelia or Toronto, you have water piped to you. And in a northern community where I'm just going on, like the training, you have to train people to run these water systems, which are quite complex. We have a community in Christian Island where the guy that has run the water system there for the last 30 years is not allowed to touch the water system because he can't pass the written exam. But he can walk you through that whole system and tell you everything about it and how to run it. But because he doesn't speak English well enough to pass the written exam, they won't let him touch it. And if the water system goes down, they'll wait 2 weeks to bring some guy in from God only knows where to flip the switch when he could have done it in seconds. So that's the stuff that people in these communities are up against. It's not just a simple matter of, Canada won't supply them with water. Canada is, I think, doing its best to get water. I think something like 68% of the water systems have been addressed. Some of them are still on the system because my community had their water addressed. They're still on the list, but they are good. They're fine. So some of this, the list you're looking at is still, some of the places that they're done. One chief said to the minister, because I know the minister, she said, you're still on the list. He said, yeah, I'm going to keep it on there until everybody else is done. So it looks like nobody got done, but in fact, people are just trying to stand up for everybody else. So anyway, I lived in Muskrat Dam for a year. I remember the water system. I mean, I would run the tap and it would be brown. And sometimes I would forget and I would drink it and I would get sick. But it's because they didn't do the proper training. The system is kind of shitty and it has to be upgraded and it's expensive. And, and as Canadians, we're the ones that also have to say to the elected officials, you either get this thing done or get out. We'll elect somebody else. Right. So, we gave Trudeau another mandate, so he better get his rear gear, I guess, and get it done. Right. Get it done. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, what do we got in the chat? You want me to look at them or are you gonna, Elaine? Well, you're on mute. You're on mute, Elaine.
I don't see anything else in the chat at the moment.
Well, there's a lot of stuff on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So the United, she's tapped up the United Nations Declaration, and the other good thing about the United Nations Declaration for all of you is the fact that it has given, this government has given it royal assent. So it's now a question of implementation, and I mean, we can be critical because of every government, because no government has really gotten it right, you know, conservative or otherwise. They just haven't, it's a big thing. I mean, I've been working on this for 45 years or more. I'm telling you, this is a humongous conversation that is not easily resolvable. But at least they give in royal assent to the United Nations Declaration. Trudeau has accepted all of the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. About 60% of those have been addressed or in progress. They're not all the government's responsibility. Some of the churches, 23 of those 94 calls to action are for the justice to resolve. 5 or 6 of them are or maybe more actually are education. 5 of them are certainly child welfare. So it's not like the government of Canada is responsible for all of them, and some of them are us people to take on. So we, you know, in Aurelia, we have Gwen Boniface, who is a senator, has set up a reconciliation circle. And people in Aurelia are a part of that conversation. And so, in the United Church, and they're doing art, and they're doing conversations, and they're doing a lot of things. And that's what that's what you can do too, is you can get involved in a reconciliation, or start one. And, you know, read a couple books that are written by Indigenous peoples about these issues, you know, so that you can actually figure out ways to make a difference. Somebody posted on Cindy Blackstock's Caring Society, you know, all of the different pieces, the Jordan's Principle, Shannon's Dream, all of the things that she's doing to try to change the trajectory of children in the system. It's a big deal. If we can stop children from being harmed, we would have healthy societies. Canadian society would do better with healthy children. And yet we have a lot of people on, I mean, let's put it this way. Indigenous peoples are often accused of being alcoholics and drinking too much. I just want you to think about this, okay? So do you know how many Indigenous peoples there are in Canada? Does any of you know? Can you tell me? Did any of you tell me? Okay. So do you know how many Canadians there are?
Yeah, Indigenous people are about 5% of the population in Canada.
Okay. Yeah. So let's give me a number though. So what does that mean?
I'm not good with numbers.
Okay.
Percentages.
Okay. So let's say for round numbers, there's about 40 million Canadians. Does that sound about right? 40 million? There's about, again, round numbers, about 2 million Indigenous people. Okay, 2 million. And that includes First Nation, Métis, Inuit, and some people that haven't come out of the closet yet because they're a little, you know, they're not sure how they would be received. Okay, so there's people that are non-status. And okay, so let's say 2 million. Research has been done on Indigenous people's consumption of alcohol, and less than 50% of Indigenous peoples actually drink, the ones that are of age. I'm not talking about children, and we have a very young population. So a significant population of children, Indigenous children, a significant part of our population are children. They don't drink. We have elders that don't drink. And then we have a very small population of the adults. And yes, we have some alcoholics in there. I'm absolutely sure we do. But, you know, that's a small population of 2 million. But Canada, prior to the pandemic, and inclusive of the 2 million Indigenous peoples, spent almost $23 billion on alcohol annually. $23 billion for 40 million people. And then spent about $14 billion cleaning up the mess, okay? On accidents, you know, job losses, stuff like that. Now that was prior pandemic. And we also know that the pandemic actually contributed to a significant amount of more drinking because people were stuck at home and in situations they weren't comfortable. And yeah, we haven't seen the numbers on that one yet, but I'm sure it'll be significant. So the reality is A lot of people drink a lot. It is not we don't hold the prize on drinking the most. We don't. You know who drinks the most? Young Indigenous or young college educated university students, women in particular. Women drink the most. So it's just like, wow. So that's myth busting. Okay, that's just telling you. And I'm not making up those statistics. You can tap it into your Google Drive and ask, and it'll tell you those numbers, and it'll tell you who actually consumes the most alcohol. Young university women.
I think Karen Nicely Mallet had a question.
Yeah, go ahead. All right, where are you?
Actually, I actually unmuted myself without someone having to tell me. First of all, this has been, I just sent my mom a note just saying this has been one of the most informative talks I have ever been involved in. And I think that your passion really shows us that if we even had an ounce of that, there'd be huge differences made. And I'm out in Winnipeg, so I'm proud that I know more about some things that are going on, because I believe that our challenges here are different, and we do all we can as far as women's groups and people I'm with. But I just wanted to say thank you, and I appreciate that. I also wanted to tell you that I think the way from now on that I'll try to explain when people question, why this and why can't they do this and why shouldn't this happen? That just what you said about we have a choice. They didn't have a choice.
Mm-hmm.
So we forget that.
Yeah.
Can you imagine, which you can, obviously, you've been through this and you have family that's gone through this, if they come to your home and say, hey, here's the thing, we're taking away your kids, and I'd rather not. Oh, well. And that, I never thought of it as, well, I've thought of it, but just, I appreciate you bringing that clearer, because all you have to say to someone is, you always have choices. We don't.
Yeah, we don't. My daughter, who is a director at the University of Ottawa and is 36 years old. She had a baby last August during the pandemic. And she was at a hospital in Ottawa when she had a guy walk through her room that didn't have a mask on, and she called the nurse and she said, to deal with this guy, he needs a mask. The nurse took one look at her, could see that she was Indigenous, and said, if you complain or try to leave, I'm calling CAS on you.
Oh, yeah.
Just like that. And
our hospitals here too.
Like, what? Like, she had done nothing other than just say this guy needs to have a mask on. But because she's Indigenous, she's automatically referred to CAS. So she said it was a real shocker for her. She was just like, oh. And we now have a lot of cases, and Wendy can attest to that, of people who have had their children apprehended. I talked a little bit about birth alerts, and have had their kids apprehended at birth, and they have jobs, they have educations, they have a home, but because they're Indigenous, or because one of them has been in care, their kids are targeted and the birth alerts are issued. So Thunder Bay, just January 2021, stopped birth alerts, and BC has stopped birth alerts. But every other province across Canada, including Winnipeg, Manitoba, still have birth alerts. And that means that children are apprehended. Mothers don't even get an opportunity to say, the opportunity to be mother, their kids are taken and they have to fight like hell to get them back. And I remember, when I was talking to some of Wendy's young women, one gal saying to me, they took one baby from me, and the second time I got pregnant, I knew how to hide, and I stayed in a maternity, what do you call it, like a pregnant mother's home until my son was old enough that they couldn't take him. Because she said, I knew they were coming for him. And she wouldn't have had an opportunity to be a mom. And that's just wrong. And that's why we're saying this whole question, you want to take on a task, take on child welfare, because, you know, that trip I made across the country, you know, informed the minister was about funding. That funding needs to go directly to communities in as many instances as possible so that they can set up prevention and help young mothers and families, you know, young families to get the care they need to keep their kids. There needs to be a better relationship with the province, who now get the resources, not the communities. It goes through the provinces, because the federal government doesn't do child welfare. They just provide resources. But it needs to hit the ground, and it doesn't right now. There needs to be a restoration of jurisdiction and authority to communities so that they have the right to choose and the right to determine what happens to their kids. And then those standards need to be revised to accommodate. I mean, I'm in a small community, way the hell and gone, further north than I've ever been, 40 below zero, and they're held to the same standards as they were in downtown Newfoundland. And they take their kids, and these people struggle. I mean, I remember one guy crying, a man crying and saying, they took my son, they sent him back at 16. He didn't speak the language. He was on some kind of drugs. They had him on antidepressants, which they stopped, which I don't think they should have, but they didn't know that. And he said, every morning I wake up, my wife and I wake up, and we're afraid that he's going to be dead, because he's so depressed, because he can't fit himself back into our community. And, you know, about 2 months later, I got a call that young man, 17 years old or 18 years old, committed suicide, because they took this kid out of the community. And everybody in the community speaks the language. They speak it in. So our society, that's the violence of benevolence. And I coined that term after going to a meeting and hearing people talk about how to fix the Indigenous problem. And it was like, when they got to me, I said, do you want me to tell you how to fix it? Get the hell out of the way and allow people the privilege of making their own decisions. And if they do ask you for help, just give them the help they ask for. Don't assume that you know better or that you're going to do more. Just give them what they ask for and allow them the privilege of making the mistakes that they need to make and having the successes that they're going to have without your interference. And if you want to be an ally, the best allies and the best leaders in the world speak last. Let the people tell you what they need. And the best allies and leaders speak last in response to. There's lots of learning we all have to do.
Lynn Taylor, I think you were next.
Oh, I was unmuted. Hi, yes.
Bye, Lynn.
First of all, thank you again for an excellent presentation and talk tonight. I think what I wanted to speak to was exactly what you were saying earlier about, you know, we get the royal assent and we get policies and procedures, and it's at a high level. I think what you've done for me tonight, as I'm sure you've done for a lot of others tonight, is to kind of give us another view into everyday life, like birth alerts. I had no idea what you were talking about, like, until you spoke about it. I've never heard of that. I had no idea that that even existed, and I'm shocked by it. But I also think that what happens is that it becomes, you know, it's newsworthy right now, and it's at the top of you know, CBC's News Hour and the election and everything. And I think what's helpful for me is to have someone like yourself who is Indigenous, who has traveled, who has gone on to these settlements and talks about everyday life. It makes it more real for me to understand so much better, because otherwise it's no different than so many other laws out there that are changing. And it's like, we're working on a resolution here in Brampton, and I've seen firsthand now what it takes to push a resolution through to the different levels. And then you wait and you wait and you wait. And this can't wait anymore. Like you said, it's been 7 generations, if not longer. And I just want to tell you how much I appreciate you taking it and making it real tonight. It's very helpful and gives me much more insight.
Good, thank you. Yeah, thank you. And the other piece of that birth alert is the other end that I think Wendy could also speak to is the whole aging out thing. You know, so we have kids that are going into these systems that are aging out too young or without the proper instruction from a family. You know, they're put in these families who get money to look after them. And I've had kids say to me, the day I turned 18 years old, right in the middle of an academic year, I came home and my bags were at the door. Because that family's not getting any money from me anymore. So it's like, bye. And they're just left with nothing. They get, and one child was a native in BC, actually, several years ago, about 3 years ago, maybe 4, threw himself out a hotel window and died because he'd been in care. He could have gone to his aunt, but his aunt and uncle were fighting. So they took him and put him in care. He went through multiple homes. And at the end of his life, at 18 years of age, he's living in a hotel. Somebody's getting like thousands of dollars a month to look after him, but he's living in a hotel and they're bringing him fried chicken or whatever. On the day he turned 18, he knew he was going to get a check for $1,200. See you later. He couldn't face that. He jumped out there, killed himself. That is not child welfare. That is not well-being. That is just, it's an industry that has harmed a lot of children from a lot of backgrounds, not just Indigenous kids. Matt Galloway, the same guy I was talking to before, said one morning that 40% of the kids in care in the greater GTA are Black. So it's people of color, kids of color that are mostly targeted and put into these systems and come out of them very, very hurt, very hurt. And our society is wondering what's going wrong. Well, it's breaking families apart. When kids will forgive you anything. I mean, like they love you. You're their parent, and we help in our community. We help the mothers. If a mother's drinking, we ask her why. What do you need? And sometimes it's about pain. Sometimes it's about a broken relationship. Sometimes it's about something else, some fear. We help her so that she keeps her kids. Because tearing her kids away from her is going to do more damage than anything else. And I still remember a gal that when I was teaching UT who had her boys taken away from her when she was quite young. She was drinking, she quit. They kept giving her hoops to jump through. By the time she was probably must be in her late 30s, she's now doing a Ph.D., still doesn't have her kids. They still refused to give it. They just kept setting up more and more hoops. And this woman died of stomach cancer at a young age from all of the stress and distress of fighting for her kids and never getting them because somebody else set up just another hoop for her to jump through. What more could this woman have done? She got sober, she got an education, and yet she still couldn't get her kids back. So when you look at Indigenous peoples and you wonder, what's the problem? It's a long-standing intergenerational impact that we're trying to navigate our way through. My parents came right out of residential school. There was addictions, there was domestic violence, there was divorce, there was problems, there was sexual assault, molestation, was all of those things that I had to navigate. I didn't want that for my daughters, so I made extra effort. I had to work really hard to make sure that they didn't have those experiences. And now my daughter's daughter will not see those kinds of experiences. So, and lots of women have made it. I want you to know that. I speak to the positive. I don't go looking for what's wrong. I want to know what's right, what's going on across Canada that is good. When I worked with United, it was either UNICEF or the United Way, I forget which one it was, asked me to review their annual report. And I went through it and then they did a section on Indigenous peoples and they said 37% of Indigenous women are in domestic violence relationships. And I said, can you just flip all those things? And can you say 63% of Indigenous women are in healthy relationships? because it's the same thing, but it says a completely different thing to your brain, right?
Yeah, it does.
So, you know, I said, flip all those statistics where they're hurtful and negative, and give people a positive view of who Indigenous peoples are, because 63% in healthy relationships is true. It's not, they're not all bad. And they're improving day by day, year by day. So I think it's important that, you know, I'll leave it at that, on that note, and thank you for your time. And I wish you all the best and stay safe.
Do you have a minute? There's a couple more
Oh,
questions.
there's a couple questions? Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Mariette, do you want to ask yours?
Mariette. All right.
Actually, I think most of it was answered in the chat. Yeah,
good.
about length of time.
And then Lynn Buxton, I think.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you, Cynthia. I'm proud to say that I'm Métis, and my son-in-law is Mohawk. My little granddaughter, of course, has her card. I've heard stories my whole life. My family's from New Brunswick, the Mi'kmaq tribe. On my mother's side of the family, one thing they did, it's made it very hard for us to trace our ancestry, is they kept changing their names because they didn't want people to know of their background. On my father's side, I do have pictures, family pictures of great-grandmother and stuff. One thing that I was told is that you're saying there's 2 million people now. They don't talk about the millions and millions of people in North America that were wiped out. And I think part of reconciliation needs to be in our history books of the slaughter and the things they did. And I think that, to me, that would be great if they put that in the history books, because then they would acknowledge it. And it would be part of healing and reconciliation. Yeah. Because I think the children need to know.
That's you're talking about my research. In fact, when I started at the University of Toronto, I said I wanted to talk about historic trauma and just exactly what you're talking about. And they said, well, there's really no such thing, or maybe you could look at the residential schools. And I said, no, it goes way back, a long way. I want to go right back to contact. And you're right. You know, anthropologists have argued, I think, amongst themselves that there were anywhere from 12 million to 120 million people living continentally. And within 100 years, something like 80% of them were wiped out because of disease and warfare and killing and all the rest of it. So yeah, they said, I said, well, we're going to put it in the literature if it's not there yet. So yeah, we are talking about it. And if you Google my name and you put in Aboriginal healing, historic trauma and Aboriginal healing, I think it's called Historic Trauma and Aboriginal Healing, a book will come up that a colleague and I wrote about exactly that, and it does have all of that history in it and what happened. Yeah. And so actually, if you put www.ahf aboriginalhealingfoundation.ca, a lot of those, and they're free, and it'll come up, historic trauma and Aboriginal healing, and it does have some of that story. Of course, it's my master's thesis was on the aftermath of the bubonic plagues in Europe and the aftermath of the epidemics on this continent, and how people responded to that kind of massive death from the bubonic plagues. So there's some of that in there. It might be interesting to you. But yes, I hear you. I agree.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Just a point too, Cynthia, and I'm proud to brag about you a little bit, because you've done such amazing work, and you know our chapter's been following it for years and years. So you're the one, I believe, who also came up with the phrase a different kind of form of complex post-traumatic stress.
Yeah.
So maybe you could talk about that a little bit. And then I just wanted to suggest maybe for some of the women on the meeting that these are some great ideas for resolutions that maybe can be put forth as well. So to, keep that in mind, because what you're talking about are actionable items. And you can really be strong allies in that way. So miigwech.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, that's the other piece. I think it just in a kind of a nutshell. I mean, post-traumatic stress response is often talked about as about individuals. Somebody goes to war and they come back from the shell. They come back what they used to call shell shock, and they struggle with that, and sometimes bad things can happen. And actually, it was Judith Herman who actually wrote a text on complex post-traumatic stress response. But I took her work it was in my work, and I applied it to the whole concept of what Lynn was talking about, is that all these people that died. So you end up having First Nations peoples with this complex post-traumatic stress response. So everybody is affected, not just one or two people. Everybody's affected at some level. And it's kind of like if we were all in a room together, like we were actually in a room together, and a bomb went off somewhere, we would all be affected, but we would all be affected somewhat differently, right? Some of us would run, some of us would fall to the ground, some of us would freeze, some of us would run for help, we'd all be affected in some way. And there's lots of examples over the course of time of people that have been in situations like that. And if people freeze or hide, they're affected longer than people who take action, right? So the kids that got, dug out of a bus that was buried with kids in it, those kids 10 years later were pretty much free of traumatic stress response, but the ones that were frozen were actually still dramatically affected. So, but when you look at the entire population of the Indigenous peoples across Canada, some people were affected very dramatically by residential schools and all of the things that have happened. And some people were able to come through it relatively unscathed, but still affected. So you have different degrees of impact. So if you can apply that concept to what you see. So you see the alcoholic person, and then you see somebody like myself or Wendy or Jocelyn, and they just seem fine. Well, we've done some of the healing work ourselves, first of all. We've done a lot of, some of the therapeutic stuff, and we've done other kinds of things, and we didn't become alcoholics or anything. So we're still fairly healthy, but other people that didn't have the tools or didn't have the supports, or didn't have a family that was there somehow to help them, or didn't have friends or circles of people like yourselves to provide that support, couldn't get up and stand up underneath that pressure. And so became alcoholics or other kinds of addicts. Sometimes it's food addict, it's not, or sex addict. It's not necessarily alcohol. Addictions play out lots of ways. So it's it's an interesting conversation. Yeah, and it could go in so many. I mean, if we actually sat down and just sort of free-formed a conversation about lots of things, we could probably come up with lots of understandings about how we're each of us, because I often say to people, 97% of the population has been affected by some form of trauma, and the other 3% are lying. We're all in this together. We've all experienced something, whether it was a divorce, a parent's death, or whatever, right? And we've all found different ways of coping. Sometimes healthy, sometimes not so healthy.
Okay, I think that's it for the questions. So,
could I say something?
Sure. Who's that?
I want to thank you very much for clearing up a lot of things that I didn't know, and yet I grew up in Lac Seul, and should have known a lot more than I did, but obviously I wasn't. I was from the other side, so to speak. And I also really, really appreciate the fact that you tell your story and you make suggestions and you tell us how we can help, and you're not saying it's your fault. And I think that's so important, because I find no matter what it is we're trying to solve in any area, if you're blaming somebody, you're not going to get anywhere. We have to work together. And I thank you so much for that. And I hope we can have you back again, because I could stay here all night. I know that would not be popular. But
well, thank you.